Just in terms of before we kind of dive into the case here, just to set up, the way we normally do this is we will share. I'll share a prompt, which is essentially a client situation. We can pause there. Make sure you don't have any clarifying questions, before we actually get into solving the case. So, another way of saying it is don't just directly jump into solving the case after the prompt. We can have a structured set of kind of questions that will help us walk through it. Does that make sense?
Yep, sounds good.
And then the other kind of setup reference point is these cases are very representative of, we try to bring our actual case experience in the interviews just to give a good demonstration of what the work typically looks like. Obviously, for confidentiality purposes and whatnot, all the numbers and the story might be completely different. So just keep that in mind as you kind of go through this.
Okay, yeah.
Awesome. So let me just pull up the prompt so that I can share. Okay, so the prompt here is my client is Cutco, which is a portfolio company of a mid-market private equity fund. Cutco is a manufacturer of water jet cutting equipment. Think about this as the equipment that is installed in industrial settings and so used in a variety of applications for cutting, mainly in manufacturing. The client is trying to assess its growth prospects through a variety of different methods. And the CEO believes that the growth prospects are likely best among the large manufacturers, so those above $1 billion in revenue. Going to pause there to see if you have any clarifying questions about the situation or company.
Yeah, so just to recap, we're Cutco, am I saying that correct?
That's right.
Okay.
Cutco, yeah.
Okay, and we are a manufacturer of water jet cutting equipment.
That's right.
Our CEO believes that, these larger companies tend to do well, and he wants us to assess the growth prospects of this portfolio company.
That's right.
Okay, so I do have a few questions.
Sure.
Is there any way you could, further explain, the business model and, what water jet cutting equipment actually is?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the case is not really focused on your content knowledge, so it's a great question to ask. So, in terms of water jet cutting, think about this as a machine that essentially uses extremely high pressure water and forces it through, a variety of materials, like for cutting purposes. So, if you have steel and you want to cut it, you're using high pressure water in essence. At times, you could also have some additives, chemicals in that water to help, make those cuts more precise or more effective, or for a variety of reasons.
So we manufacture the machines?
That's right. Yeah, we manufacture those machines, and those are then used in a number of manufacturing applications. Think about aerospace, automotive, electronics, other advanced manufacturing, and really think about that water jet cutting as a method that gives you very precise cuts compared to what some of the other methods might be.
Okay. And then my second question is, more so goal oriented. When he says assess growth prospects, do we have any timeline or revenue goal per se?
Yeah, no, it's a good question on that. Let's just assume that we don't know much about it, and so we can step back and think a little more holistically. But it's a good question in terms of bounding how to think about your growth options.
Okay. Cool. That's it for me on the question side. So let's get into it.
That sounds great. So one of the things that we typically try to do in terms of any situation like this where someone's talking about growth and where to get it, you want to first size and understand what does the market look like, right? There's a bunch of other factors to also consider, but just using that as a starting point. I guess question for you is, how would you approach finding the size and growth for the market for water jet cutting machines among large companies?
Okay, so can I take 30 or so seconds to think about this?
Sure, that sounds good. And just for reference, you don't need to put numbers on it. I'm just trying to
Okay.
understand what your sizing approach and like what kind of equation variables you're going to use for sizing.
And one quick clarifying question: are we sizing this market for the world or just the United States?
Let's work with US.
U.S. Okay. Cool. Okay. So I'm not too familiar with the market, but you know, to size it, I think we kind of need to look at, two main things. There's those companies that already, utilize these machines. And then there's these companies that could potentially utilize these machines if they were given, if they were advertised to correctly or convinced that, this machine would be an asset to them. So I would kind of like to look at this, in two parts. First, for those who currently use the machines, and then for those who could potentially use the machines. So, so for those who currently have the machines, I mean, I do not have, any estimate or numbers to give, but the key metric that we would need is, the lifespan of the machine. So how long does the machine work for? So if you were to say that a machine were to last for 10 years,
Yep.
then, the market would be,
Yeah.
1/10 of all the total
Yep.
machines in use for 1 year. So
Yep.
that's kind of how I would look at, sizing that segment of the market. And
So
then
you're saying 1/10 of the total base would be buying each year, and then you would multiply that with what to get to the market size?
by the price of the machine, which again, I have no idea how much machines cost. I assume they're somewhat expensive.
Yeah.
And then for those who, could potentially want the machine, this is, a bit more difficult, but I think a decent way we could look at this is, we could look at, the current clientele and kind of, estimate a percentage of, you look at, say, I think you said, what, aerospace industry. So you could look at one such industry and look at, the percentage of companies that, do utilize the machine, and then look within the industry, companies most similar to those companies that utilize the machines, and then, get an estimate, based off that, and potentially based on, how, obviously you as Cutco, you're not marketing for the entire industry, you're marketing for yourself. But if there was somehow some industry-wide marketing campaign where all the companies just decided, we're going to go after these companies, then you could, essentially take a percentage or a success rate and multiply that by the number of companies that you are marketing to. And then once again, multiply by the price.
Makes sense. So if I were to bucket this, you said you're going to look at the current base and what's the replacement from that on an annual basis. You look at adoption from those that have not at all adopted, and what's that going to look like. If I were to tell you, you might still be missing one more component, what would that be?
So we have those who have adopted, those who might adopt. Okay. So yes, there is. I mean, are you hinting at potentially moving into a completely, different industry?
No, I was thinking, you can replace your existing base, but you might also want to have more capacity,
Yes.
and so you might grow from
more
that.
capacity as well. Yeah.
Okay. And then just last question, there's a bunch of other areas I want to kind of dig into, but just on the install base, how would you go about figuring that out? That seems like crucial component of the sizing here. Just curious, like what approaches would you use? Probably sources, methods to figure out what's the install base for water jet cutting equipment.
So what do you mean by install base?
I'm sorry, I used the term install base. What I meant was like the existing base, like the ones that are
Okay.
currently using it. How do we figure out how many companies and how many units are being currently used right now in the US?
Okay. So, I mean, I'd probably start with, you know, I'd look at our core industries, and then within within each industry, we kind of estimate the usage rate of these water jet machines. Um, what is somewhat difficult is to, kind of know the exact number of machines per company. So based on some metric, I'm not sure whether it would necessarily be, it could be, number of employees, square footage per factory. Um, I honestly don't know what the most appropriate metric would be.
Makes sense, but essentially you're kind of making an assumption based on any kind of secondary data that you can find around company cuts and the size, or whether it's on revenue or capacity or manufacturing ability or anything like that. Makes sense.
Yes, exactly.
Cool. Let me move to the second part of this case. I'm going to share a slide with you right now. I want you to have a look at this slide and tell me what do you see in here, and then we can talk through it.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
So WaterJet is what we're in, and these are our three competitors. Is that correct? Laser, mechanical, and flame?
Alternative approaches, yes.
Alternative approaches. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So at first glance, and what seems to be most substantial and consequential, is that these figures, these projections, they're expecting us to lose a tremendous amount of market share, more than 50% in some industries and even more in others. So like the industrial and aerospace industries, we're expected to lose 50% market share. Automotive industry, even more. Technology products, a little less. Basic materials, well over 50%, and defense, over 50% as well.
Uh-huh. That makes sense. Waterjet, where it is right now in terms of the usage versus where it's expected to be in the future is dropping massively. What else do you see on here, or what other thoughts do you have after looking at this slide?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, if we're losing this market share, someone's, coming in to fill that demand. So just looking at these figures, it does seem like it is, a combination of, kind of all three. But, it's interesting how I would say that flame in the automotive industry is going to go from 0 to 20%, which is, there has to be some underlying real reason for that to be the case.
Uh-huh.
And it looks like, in that section, like flame is the one, most directly eroding our market share. So I think kind of a good case study or good thing to look at would be, why flame over waterjet, not just for the automotive industry, but, maybe this can provide insight into, other industries as well.
Yeah, no, would love to come back to this as time permits. That would be an interesting area to probe. But essentially, I think the takeaway that you're getting at here is that the install base current versus what's going to be expected in the future is looking massively different for us, right? So that
Yes,
doesn't sound
absolutely.
too rosy for our client here. Um, Let me go to the next part of this. So here you have just the current usage. It's not by industry. On the left side, it's all, just set up by exactly the way you're looking at it. It's call this as the install base as well, just at a rolled
Okay.
up level. And then the right side, you have likelihood to add or replace. I want you to do two things on this one, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
One is just getting at a combined annual purchase rate for this market, not just Waterjet, just overall. And then more importantly, obviously, kind of how does your take change from the prior slide to this slide in terms of what you see here?
So first you want to combine annual purchase rate, and then
Yeah,
the second thing you said was
just the takeaway, in
okay,
terms of
takeaway.
how
So
we are building. Yeah,
qualitative. So combined annual purchase rate. So I'm not actually familiar with that term.
sure. Sure. It just means that on the left side, what you're seeing is what currently has been like it's existing in these organizations, right? If you think about where all types of cutting tools used, let's make up an example. Like there are 100 cutting tools used total,
Uh-huh.
individual units. 40 of those are water jet, 30 of those are laser, 15 of those
Mm-hmm.
are mechanical, and so on. And on the right side, it's saying that for every unit that exists right now, what percentage would end up either adding one more or replacing it over the course of next year. And so what I'm asking is essentially, what does this translate to in terms of an annual purchase, whether it's a replace or new add for the
Uh-huh.
market
So
percentage?
we're saying that 35% of our water jet machines will no longer work and need to be replaced next year. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
or 35, like combination
Or
of
or
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 they'll
there will
add
be
one. Yeah.
yeah, this is what we
Yeah.
were
So
talking about earlier.
yep, exactly.
Yes.
So
Okay.
right now you have 40 units. About 15 of those, I'm just making up an example here. 15 of those might get replaced, and they still would add 20 more. So that's what it comes down to. What I'm trying to figure out is like what's the annual purchase rate at a full market level?
Yeah. Okay. So it seems like we just have to do some multiplication and addition to find this combined annual purchase rate. So starting with no cutting tools, we would take 10% of 10%, which is 1%. So I'm just going to write no cutting tools, 1%. And then moving on to flame, we have to take 5% of 30% or 30% of 5%, doesn't matter, which is 6%. Then moving on to mechanical, we have to take 20% of 15%, which is 3%. And I'm realizing I did this flame calculation wrong. It should be 1.5%. And then for laser, we do 30 of 35%. So that's going to be, it's going to be 10. Yeah, that should be 10.5%. And then finally, for water jet, we're doing 40% of 35%. So that's the 10.5% calculated previously, plus another 3.5%. So that should get us to 14%.
Okay.
and then we just have to add all these up. So we should get 1 plus 1.5 is 2.5, plus 3 is, or here, let's do it this way. So 10.5 plus 1.5 is 12%, plus 1%, plus 3%, plus 14%. So 13%, 16%, plus 14% should get us a 30% combined annual purchase rate.
That makes sense. So what do you make of just what you see on the slide and just your learnings from the prior slide?
Yeah. So I mean, it seems like a 30% combined annual purchase rate is, relatively high. It means that, we're either, replacing a lot of our existing equipment or, cutting tools in general. They're very valuable for whatever industry. And, these industries are growing and they need to, add more cutting tools. For, our situation specifically with the 35%, replacement rate, that is, a bit of hope in our, given, kind of the decline that we saw from last slide. That being said, the figures from last slide, there was no timeline, so that could be, well into the future. So what I can kind of hypothesize out of this for, our, water jet portfolio company is that, while, decline is definitely a fear just due to like penetration from, alternative methods, this decline could be, relatively slow due to the fact that, the add or replace is relatively high at 35% for us and 30% for, the market in total.
Yeah. From an annual basis, how much does the company care about from its annual revenue standpoint for next year? How much does the company care about, that longer term, that base is moving away versus what they're getting next year, for example?
Yeah, and I think it's also important to, consider this like within the lens of, private equity. We're likely not holding this business for 50 more years. The average holding period is going to be, I'm not sure specifically, but, if we can kind of, eke out, if we're concerned about, profitability, I know this is more of a growth question, but alternatively, it's potentially safe to say that, this business can remain relatively profitable into the near future.
Yeah, one thing to remember from a private equity lens is that even though a given fund's investment time frame might end, they still are thinking about longer term value creation, because at the end of the day, if they are exiting out of it, they need to show they need to demonstrate the value for a future investor as well. So just in those lens, we can move to the next one.
Okay.
I'll come back to the slide on it, but just curious. Earlier you were talking about flame and some of the other areas. In the spirit of figuring out this trend that longer term there's going to be a shift away from water jet, how would you look at the adjacencies that we had there? Laser, mechanical, flame. Let's assume the world is just those three adjacencies outside of water jet. How would you evaluate, if any of those are worth getting into as a way to kind of de-risk longer term?
Okay. Do you mind if I take like 30 seconds to think about this?
Sure.
So we've kind of already like looked at the market in total, and we've seen that, laser, mechanical, and flame are, all growing and eking in a water jet. And we've also seen that, the what is this term? The annual purchase rate is, relatively high for the market. So what I would like to more so focus on is, if there exists any real synergies between, what we do with the water jet company and, between flame, mechanical, and laser. So what I can think of is, A, like industry expertise. Do we as, private equity operators, do we know about laser, mechanical, and flame at all? Or do we have, employees at, some of our portfolio companies who have, such knowledge? And then I think there's some, revenue synergies as well. We probably have a pretty strong existing client base with our, water jet customers. And if they're looking to get into laser, mechanical, or flame, perhaps they would be more willing to buy from us.
Uh-huh.
And then perhaps there could also be some cost synergies on, the manufacturing and distribution side as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess how would you figure out between laser, mechanical, and flame? Should you go after all three? Should you do only one? And how do you prioritize that one?
Yeah, that's a really good question. If we could, perhaps, reference the graph. We don't actually have to, but obviously looking at the one that's, projected to, eke into the water jet market the most. That's definitely one main consideration. And then essentially going back to the synergies, we could also look at, where there is the most overlap. On the revenue side, I assume that, all of these methods for cutting, they're not exactly the same, so maybe figuring out the one that is most similar to water jet in terms of, the results, and then, looking to break into that in order to, retain customers.
Makes sense. And then apologies in the spirit of time here, just last piece here. So all the stuff that you mentioned, we try to summarize that here, right? Looking at the three categories, the adjacencies, and just looking at a few metrics around it. Looking at this, what would you want to recommend in terms of which direction to go into?
Okay. So, and these scales, they all represent, the likelihood that we're able to do this.
The scale represents the metric, so market penetration, high or low.
Okay.
And likewise, yeah.
Okay. So, and a low market penetration means we have a low chance to penetrate this market. It doesn't mean that the market is easily penetrated.
No, it's current state. So this will be similar to the charts. Rather than putting the numbers again, it's just summarized into basically what it says is that mechanical has moderate penetration in the current state, meaning, I'll just make up an example. 20-30% of the companies are already using mechanical cutting tools right now. And then flame has very low market penetration. It's a relative scale. So flame could be 2% as an example, and so on.
Okay. So, I think we can consider all options, but I would probably be most inclined to, go with flame, due to the fact that, although the market is, not incredibly, penetrated, we did see in previous slides that they were expecting, pretty rapid growth into the future from, zero penetration to a significant share. So that kind of proves that this technology exists and it works. And that can also be seen by this middle box. And then additionally, the trust and fit with, Cutco and our current customers is relatively high. And, considering we are a private equity firm and, synergies are pretty important, I think that's, definitely something we need to consider.
Makes sense. Okay, I think we've gonna run out of time here. So I guess if you can, so we talked about the adjacent side of the growth, right? If water jet cutting equipment over the longer term, that base is kind of declining, even though near term we're fine,
Yeah.
um, that longer term is going away. We might want to get into one of these areas. What could you do in in the current state just to shore up your position on the water jet cutting side itself?
Um,
Sorry, but just to be clear, by shore up your position, what I mean is like you
yeah.
still want to get growth, right? So yes, you'll go longer term. You would want to pick one of these categories to kind of tap into the higher growth areas. Um, but before you do that, are there anything else on the water jet cutting side that you would consider that can still give you higher growth, in the current state?
Yeah. I mean, I think one obvious thing we could do if it, doesn't reduce profitability too much is we could obviously look at lowering prices.
That's
And what this does is, it's machinery. It's somewhat long term. So if you can, convince people to buy, a bunch of these machines now, um, you're essentially, they're dependent on those machines for X amount of time,
yeah,
and perhaps that results in, you
yeah,
know, a more long term dependence. So I would look at lowering
yep,
price as
that
one
makes
thing.
sense. That makes sense. Yeah, we've definitely run out of time. So let's just, if you can, just summarize your key takeaways. Thinking more about the client situation and what do we want to say where we are and what we still have to figure out.
Yeah. So you know, uh, you guys represent Cutco. You are the private equity operator of that business. You guys make water jet machines that are used to cut in a variety of different ways. Some of our projections and external projections predict that, the water jet method of cutting is going to be, getting eked out into the future by mechanical flame and laser. This is, obviously is a concern as we want to, grow the business and, add value to it. One key takeaway is that, kind of in the short term, the turnover on these machines is still relatively high. So there still exists demand in the short term. However, long term, this business is destined to struggle. So what I would recommend is, looking to expand into either, mechanical flame or laser. I personally think that flame offers, the best opportunity due to like the low market penetration, the high percentage that we can, penetrate that market. And there is also, some fit with our current customer base. As next steps, I'd like to further look into, the mechanical flame and laser markets and do more due diligence to see which one is, truly best to break into.
Got it. That sounds great. And that's essentially the end of the case.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Awesome. So I have some feedback and happy to kind of dive into that piece, but just curious, any reflections in terms of just how the process went for you?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this was a pretty niche case. I definitely did enjoy it. It was kind of fun to think about a, not unique industry. Um, I would say the market sizing was, a little tough because,
Yeah,
usually when you practice this stuff, you just algorithmically go through it and you
yeah,
couldn't really do that.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, outside of that, I think it was, you know, pretty interesting. I think I could have been, a little more specific, with
Good.
some of my recommendations.
Yeah,
And I don't know, I think some of that was just like it being a really obscure market.
sure.
But yeah, overall it was good, and I had a good time.
Yeah, no, I think you hit on some of the things that I was also thinking about, but good job on this. When just stepping back before I get into some of the specifics here, when not just Stax, pretty much any consulting firm that does case interviews as a method of kind of understanding how candidates think and how they process information and things like that. The purpose is never about, or in most cases, is not about your existing content knowledge, right? And so that's why you could take this and replace it with a widget, if you will, right?
Uh-huh.
Um, And it really boils down to 6 areas that, in my view, like most think about. One is, do you capture the problem statement? Like, what is the central issue here? And I think you did a pretty good job at that in terms of figuring out, okay, we need to figure out how do we grow this business, and is there a timeline or a certain target that we should look at? Great questions. In this case, we didn't have any prompts around that. The second part is structure, and this part is a very critical component of any case interview, right? So think about VC, like mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. The idea is that when you're trying to attack a problem, have you identified the distinct buckets that when they add up, that in and of itself, they are, distinct. And then when you add them up, it can answer the question, right? Like, I think you did a fairly good job at that. I can get you, a few components around that, but it's really getting back to like, how do you structure the idea? The third part is prioritizing, right? You're not going to be able to go into all of those 3, 5 areas around growth. How do you quickly, once you have laid out, here are the 5 issues to consider, how do you quickly say, I want to put time in 3 of these? And I think even there, if you think about how the case went, there were times that you would kind of lay out the ideas, and then, we would work through kind of how to prioritize and which one to kind of double click on. Obviously, typically cases like these might be even, you might have 10 more minutes, for example. Fourth area is quantifying. And the idea here is not just about like, can you do math, right? Because that, yeah, we all can. It's more about, the comfort with math and like the mental math. So making approximations, I think you did well by just like explaining what you were doing, because especially in a remote environment, it's not very easy to figure that out. But just thinking about, mental math and how can you quickly get there so that you can press on the issue. And then fifth is around synthesizing. I think this is where you did a very good job. I agree with you that, towards the end, when you get to recommendations, I think one of the areas that you treated, that you treated mechanical, flame, and laser as like all combined, like one of these areas we would want to get into. We have had data, we've looked at it, you had some interesting takeaways from it. You could lead with that and say, well, there are a bunch of other areas to get into, but laser or mechanical, sorry, I forgot which one you mentioned, but flame is most interesting here because it's it's a really high growth market, and allows us to backfill the revenue over the longer term. And then just overall comfort and poise. I think you held well, like comfort, poise. I mean, like how do you communicate and things like that. I think you were very confident in how you were talking about it. I think there were a couple of times where you probably got thrown off by the term or the data set that you're looking at, and it's all good. And the way you handled it is the way to go about it. Just like ask questions for clarification, but also try to figure out, do I care about the details of it? There's a relative balance there. So that was all. I had more specific. I think you did did a good job in terms of the upfront part, kind of seeing the trend. I think there it's also like the first slide that I'd shown. I think there it's also just like laying out ideas. So obviously, when you first see the slide, you're looking at the data and trends, and you talk about it, and then you kind of pause and say, okay, I got this, but that's still not answering growth. For me to answer growth, I need to look at, and that's where the second slide came in, right? So just thinking about that kind of flow.
Yeah. Thanks for that feedback.
Yeah. I don't know if you have any other reactions. I know we're going to run up against time, but
just one last thing I would say is, kind of keeping the objective, which was growth, in mind, throughout the entire case. I think there were maybe, a few times where I let that slip, and, I could have, looked at the figure and then connected it back to that a little more precisely. So I feel like that's one thing I could have done better. But yeah, overall, as I said, good case, enjoyed it. And yeah, thanks for doing this.